There are three ways to help people who need help. Government can try to do it, give people money, start programs. Charities do that too, and I'd say they're better at teaching people how to help themselves, or as the saying goes, teach a man to fish. Then there's a third way. I think it's the best way, and I'll get to that later in the show. But first, let's debate the first two. When I was in college, President Lyndon Johnson declared an all-out war on human poverty. He said, for the first time in our history, it's possible to conquer poverty. I believed him then, but then I watched his poverty programs create more poverty. Government spent trillions of dollars, and people are still poor. People on the left say the money was still worth it. Look at this chart. It shows that the poverty rate fell sharply after the war on poverty began. And that's great, but wait. If you extend the chart back a few years to when data was first kept on the poverty rate, you notice that it was already falling just as fast. But then it stopped falling about 7 years after the war on poverty began. History professor David Beito says that's because government encouraged poor Americans to be dependent on government and stay poor. But Mike Konczal of the Roosevelt Institute, named after the president who helped begin the welfare state, says, no, we need more government aid. More? You always want more, you guys. Trillions isn't enough?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the balance between charity and government. I mean, there's never been a period where it was just private charity. The government's always been involved, whether it was Civil War pensions or mother pensions or the background of the poorhouse or bankruptcy laws. You know, there's never been a purely private space.
But it was 99% private.
And as we'll hear,
government was tiny then.
We had a voluntary sector that was able to provide some social insurance. We shouldn't romanticize the past. They mostly provided funeral benefits, maybe some sick days, maybe if you were in a big city, a doctor
people were
once
on
in a
their
while.
own.
Absolutely. And you know,
and we grew the country. We became the most prosperous country in the world, from third world to first world.
Well, what destroyed that system was the Great Depression. The Great Depression hit it in exactly the worst way, because when people couldn't work or couldn't find jobs, they needed more charity, and you know, charities simply couldn't raise money at that time. So you saw a whole system of voluntarist societies that were trying to really balance people against the risks of economic life get wiped out.
David, he said that proved that government has to step in.
Well, I don't think it proves it at all. In fact, it sort of proves in some sense you don't want to have governmental policies that cause 10 years of double-digit unemployment that you had with both Hoover and Roosevelt and their interventionist policies. However, I disagree about the characterization of the mutual aid organizations, at least, that I've written about. I looked at 65 fraternal societies, mutual aid groups that provided social welfare.
And we should say you've written a book about this.
Yeah, only five ceased operation during the Great Depression. In fact, at the end of the Great Depression, they were devoting more money to social welfare than they were before the Great Depression. What hurt them was you had 10 years of double-digit unemployment, so people couldn't pay dues. You can't keep carrying people on the rolls.
Explain the mutual aid societies.
Well, these were mutual insurance organizations, and basically you'd pay membership dues like you'd pay to the, I don't know, American Automobile Club or your professional organization. They would provide sick benefits, early form of health insurance. Some of them had hospitals, some of them had orphanages, some of them had homes for the elderly.
They'd step in when they saw that people needed help, but they could make judgments. They could say, yeah, he needs help, but this guy, no, he needs to just work harder. Government, Mike, can't do that. Government just gives money to everybody who qualifies, and hence that chart that shows the poverty rate went down, but then it's gone up and down ever since. We taught people to depend on government, and we made them passive.
Well, one thing that I think is really important is that social spending does increase because the government takes over the really big risks, the risks of poverty in old age, of decrepity in old age, and the real economic risks of the business cycle. I mean, the system may have worked very well in the late 19th century, but now we live in a system where whole industries can disappear because of an app on a phone. Economic security has gone up. That's great. That means dynamism and growth, but it does mean that you need a deeper set of pockets in order to sustain people's ability to transition through jobs, transition through the life cycle, and retire with a basic decency and basic amount of money to get by.
David, it seems all wrong to me.
There was not one best system before the rise of the welfare state. There were fraternal societies, there were other kinds of institutions of self-help. There was private old age insurance, an early form of the individual retirement account that was banned during the progressive era called tontine insurance. 9 million people had tontine policies.
But
so
it was insufficient, clearly,
experiments.
otherwise Roosevelt wouldn't have created Social Security.
Given the circumstances they faced during the Great Depression, created by government policies and prolonged by government policies, the Roosevelt administration and the Hoover administration, I think these organizations did well.
You love Social Security, but it's bankrupt.
There's a small spending gap. President Obama's proposed cutting it a bit. He wants Republicans to raise taxes a bit to cut it in half. It's a manageable, sizable gap. A decent social insurance network allows private charity to thrive. Because when you take these really difficult problems of how we solve poverty and old age, how we solve insurance against the business cycle, then charity can focus on much more nimble, much more targeted, much more humanistic things. As the theologian Liz Bruning would say, charity isn't really about money, it's about actions, it's about brotherhood and love. And you can't just substitute that in for social insurance, which requires a lot of money.
But there's so much more money now than there was during the Great Depression. There are these billionaires who have billions that they're looking to do something with.
And they want to donate it to Harvard, and they want their name on an opera.
But if there wasn't this bloated welfare bureaucracy, I bet they'd step in and fix that too.
Well, if you talk to food banks, for instance, in New York, after the sequestration had cut some food insurance, they're really worried. They're really worried about cuts to food stamps and cuts. They don't think private money is going to automatically flush in.
You've eliminated a lot of social capital, which has spillover effects. You had these rich social networks in many of these poor neighborhoods. Many of these networks no longer exist precisely because the rise of the welfare and regulatory state, where you've destroyed a lot of job opportunities.
If there wasn't all this government, do you agree with me that the private sector would just leap in?
I think it would. People are resourceful. An example were blacks after the Civil War, freed from slavery recently, but they created two-parent family systems. They had a network of mutual aid organizations they created, very vibrant. Despite the fact that they're incredibly low incomes, not ideal by any means, but I think people are more resourceful than we give them credit for, and I think we find that among a lot of the immigrant groups as well who created mutual aid organizations.
Well, I certainly agree with you, but if you listen to the media and the political class, Mike has won this argument. At election time, most every politician says something like this.
We've got to keep creating jobs, and then we've got to make sure that wages and benefits are such that families can rebuild a little bit of security.
We have a plan to lift people out of poverty.
That last guy was from Australia. It's the instinct of the politician always to say this is government's job. And people believe that.
This is a way politicians win votes and win elections.
These things can exist together and they can work together. I think we do a disservice to put them in the state and charitable sectors in strong opposition. They're good partners at building a more robust and economically secure society.
As the state grows, the private sector doesn't shrink?
Charitable giving's up as well. And again, it's targeted on things where I think charitable giving can make a huge difference in building up individuals and building up communities. It's not having to worry about things like how do we provide sick days for people, which is a very difficult process for small individuals to do in small groups.
Government should require that.
I think we look around the world and we see government providing it, and we see that it's largely works. I mean, elderly poverty
It largely doesn't work, but thank you, Mike and David.